So I said we would begin looking at rest, and I suggested that maybe we could go back to Genesis, or all throughout the Bible we would have a landscape or a pathway, a neighborhood of what rest is. And we will end up in Genesis, but we're going to start out in Hebrews. That's where your lesson started, and specifically in Hebrews chapter 4. This is by design because weeks 5 and 6 of this study are going to spend a lot of time in Hebrews chapter 3 and 4. More than any New Testament passage, I believe Hebrews chapter 3 and 4 to be the most important passage regarding biblical rest in the New Testament. There's a lot of different places that talk about biblical rest. We'll look at those as well. But Hebrews 3 and 4 is where we're going to spend 2 weeks, weeks 5 and 6 in this class. We're going to unpack it and see what it says. We're not going to do the whole thing today, but we're just going to use it as a launching pad to get back to Genesis, okay? The first part of the Bible, the first part of the story where rest appears. And it was specifically Hebrews chapter 4, verses 8 through 11 that you looked at in your lesson. And so I'm going to march through just briefly this little section of Scripture. And in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 8, what it says is, "For if Joshua had given them rest." Now, I've highlighted Joshua. Depending on the version you have, many of the earlier versions, translations into English, way back, have the word Jesus there. It's because in the Greek, the name Jesus that we translate into Jesus and that we translate into Joshua is the same Greek word. So if you're using the King James Version, it actually still says Jesus there. Most of the modern newer translations. The only reason I stop and point that out is because it's important we understand who that is. It's not talking about Jesus. Jesus would upend this thing and put the whole argument actually upside down. So, for if Joshua had given them rest, okay, he would not have spoken of another day after that. Well, who's the he? I've highlighted some terms. So we got Joshua, who's the person that followed Moses, right? Moses is the guy that got the 10 Commandments up on the mountain. So when we're talking about rest, Moses is your 10 Commandments guy. Joshua is the guy that followed it and continued the ministry of Moses into the Promised Land. But it says, "For if Joshua had given them rest, he," who's the he? Well, out of context, it's kind of hard to say, but earlier in chapter 3, there's a Psalm of David that's quoted. And it's referring to David there, that he. So if Joshua had given them rest, he, David, who wrote the Psalm 95 that was quoted in the last chapter, would not have spoken of another day after that. So there's this idea, this conversation in Hebrews chapter 4, talking about what rest is and saying Joshua wasn't able to give them rest. David spoke about it approximately 300 years later, and he was still looking for it when he mentioned it. And, yes, so that's a great question, and I wasn't prepared to answer it, but I will, because I know the answer. Why is it a capital H instead of a lowercase h? There's a debate as to whether that's David saying it or God. And the answer is because it's David writing a psalm and God inspired. So it's a translational choice to make that a capital H there. But whether it's David or God, it's the psalm, it's the message of God through Psalm 95 that David wrote. Does that make sense? Yeah, so that's a great question. I didn't even, I've answered that before in other settings, and so I'm glad I had that in my back pocket. The important thing to notice before we move on to the last couple, 3 verses here is in a conversation, probably the most relevant conversation in the New Testament about what biblical rest is, we're talking about the character Joshua and we're talking about the character David, or a psalm that David wrote. What are we not talking about? We're not talking about the 4th commandment. The idea of biblical rest, or Sabbath, which is the term used here, Sabbath, it doesn't bring up the 4th commandment. But that's where our cul-de-sac of conversation is on this topic in the church today. we go to the fourth commandment, we get stuck there and lost there. And what I hope to point out and show through this entire study is this idea of rest is much bigger than one aspect of what rest might be pictured as in the Old Testament, okay? And I think that's what this shows. We're talking about years and years after Moses, and then David, 300 years after that, is still looking for it. So if the fourth commandment had been the end all, it seems like we'd be talking about the fourth commandment here, but that's not the context. And what it says in verse 9 is, so there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And it's important for us to understand that this topic is not done. We're not done with it. God's not done with this topic. But the problem is, because of our confusion in the church today, huge segments of people, almost the whole next generation of believers, have completely abandoned the idea of what Sabbath might be because it's so confusing, right? And so what the other thing I get out of this is God's not done with this idea yet. There's something about rest, Sabbath rest, that God expects us to stay engaged with. If you go down to verse 11, it says this, therefore let us be diligent. Hebrews is a New Testament, post-Jesus his ministry. Be diligent to enter that rest. It's a message to New Testament believers. Don't jump ship, lean in, right? To use modern day language. So, he's not done with it. We need to be diligent to enter it. But here in verse 10, some confusing language. I want to explain it. And we have some capital H's on the his too. So here it's definitely God for sure. And I don't think any other options. For the one, I've highlighted some of these in green and some of these in blue. The one, who's the one? The one is a believer who enters rest, okay? For the one who has entered his rest, that's God's rest, has himself, the believer, also rested from his works, the believer's works, as God did from God's works. Did you pick up? It's a bit of a confusing statement. For the one who has entered God's rest, so the believer who has entered God's rest, has as a believer himself also rested from his personal works, the way God did from God's works. What is that even referring to? When was it that God was working and God rested from his works? It's back in Genesis, right? So we're using this as a springboard. What I'm suggesting to you is we're not springboarding back to Exodus 20. That's not where it sends us. We're later going to be talking about Joshua's ministry and David's psalm in great detail for what they might have to say. But right now, what we're going to do is use this to springboard back to the book of Genesis and begin asking that question, what is it about God's rest? How is that defined? What does it even mean when God rested? Because what this is telling us is if we can figure out how God rested, what that means, then we'll be able to figure out what kind of rest we are called to, because it links the two types of rest together and says they're similar. You as a believer, your rest is going to be similar to God's rest.